Welcome back to Reading Bear. Today, we will take a look at some new malicious compliance stories. And if you enjoyed my content, please don't forget to subscribe to my channel and post some bear emojis in the comments. Let's go!
The first one is titled, Care Home Worker. A few years ago I took a job in a small nursing home. I was always early and clocked in when I got there, so I had no idea that if I clocked in 1 minute late they wouldn't pay me for the next 14 minutes of my work. I would often work through my breaks as there was never enough staff to cover the shifts and I didn't want the residents to suffer. One day I gave a friend a lift into work as usual and she told me about the lack of pay if you were even 1 minute late, but if you arrived early they would ask you to start straight away and not pay you. I was shocked. Well, the day came that I was late. 1 minute late only, and I knew that I wasn't going to be paid for the next 14 minutes, so rather than start work I went straight to the staff room and put the kettle on. The supervisor came to find me less than 5 minutes later and demanded that I get to work. I told her that if she wasn't going to pay me, I wasn't going to work. She was furious. I don't think any care workers had ever answered her back. I waited until the 14 minutes had elapsed and got back to work. Later that day the manager asked me to see her in her office as the supervisor had complained about my rudeness. I stood my ground, even though I was actually really worried I was going to be fired. I said, "I'm always early, I start work when I get here knowing you aren't paying me, and I have never minded until I was told that you dock our pay if we are 1 minute late. So there is no way that I'm working if you refuse to pay me, and I will no longer start work early if the supervisors think it's okay to be rude to me." The next one is titled, The Day I Was Hired and Fired by a Law Firm. So this is about 5 years ago. I worked as a chef at a bakery. It was my job to make everything but the baked goods. Every morning the baker and I would walk in at about 4 a.m. and knock out all the food needed for the day. This would leave me ready to go home around 10 a.m. or so. This put us at the perfect time to deliver online orders. It was common for companies or other entities to place large catering orders with us. The baker and I would split them down the middle and deliver them on our way home. The delivery in question was for Bob, Dick, and Harry, attorneys at law. I have never delivered to BD&H before, but they were a regular of sorts. Every financial quarter, they would hold a huge meeting. This meeting would require roughly $700 of bagels and bagel accessories. This spread included 8 dozen bagels, all 10 of our flavors of cream cheese, pastries, brownies, and enough coffee to power a college dorm though finals week. My passenger seat, entire back seat, and entire trunk are filled with food. Now BD&H is located on the 9th floor of a commercial skyscraper deep in an industrial complex downtown. Parking was non-existent. There were meters outside the building, but I knew I would need close to 10 trips to deliver all this food, and didn't have a lot of change on me. Company policy was to just pay whatever fines I needed to park and then turn in my receipts. The money would end up on my next paycheck. So the building has its own parking garage, so I pull on in. The security guard, let's call him Sam, stops me and says that the parking garage is for employees only. I happily show him my delivery invoice, and offer him a bribery bagel, never leave the store without at least 2. Sam refuses the bagel and says I can park in one of the guest spots on the bottom floor. The fee is $5 for every 30 minutes, minimum $10. I thank him and head to the bottom floor of the garage. So there are a total of 6 guest parking spaces. Just 6. All of them are taken. I head back up to talk to Sam, when I see an open parking spot reserved for Bob, Dick and Harry, attorneys at law. There are cars in every spot, with many spots being reserved for employees by name. The last spot is empty, and is reserved for guest of BD&H. Perfect. I pull on in. I grab the most important part of the delivery, the coffee, and head to the stairwell. I get into the elevator and hit the button for floor 9. The elevator asks for my employee ID card. Well, crud. So, I try the lobby. That works. From there it's 9 flights of stairs until I am outside the law firm of Bob, Dick, and Harry. After introducing myself, I am shown to the room where the meeting will take place. A table is set aside for me. I set down the coffee and head for trip number 2. That is when I see Sam talking to the receptionist. He runs over and starts shouting at me. "I am putting a boot on your ducking car. I told you to park in guest on the bottom floor." I don't get a word in before he launches into a speech about security and how I could be hurting his building or people. That is when a very well-dressed man walks over. It so happens to be Bob, the Bob of Bob, Dick and Harry's. Bob asks what is the problem and soon the two are arguing. Bob, Op is delivering food for my meeting. He is allowed to use my parking spots. Sam, those parking spots belong to the building. You are leasing them like you lease this floor. I am the one who says who can park there. He isn't an employee, so he isn't parking. Bob, then I am making him an employee. Sam, you can't do that. Bob, you know what? You are right. Harry. Harry. Get over here. Harry walks over with an amused look on his face. Bob, Harry here is the head of our HR department. Harry, hire this boy. Harry pulls out a piece of paper and scribbles, "Op is now a member of Bob, Dick, and Harry's," and signs it, then asks me to sign as well. I do so. Bob reaches over to the receptionist, who is already grabbing some things. Bob, here is your employee badge, your parking permit and your elevator key card. Now please, do the job I have hired you to do, and deliver my bagels. Sam looks on in utter fury as I ride the elevator down to my car. 7 sweet elevator rides later, all the food is delivered. Bob and Harry meet me at the table. Bob, Op, you have made great strides in this company and I am proud of your work, but I feel it is time for us to part ways. Here is your final check. Bob then hands me a crisp $50 bill. Harry, and your severance package. Now please be sure to return your badge and card on the way out. Harry hands me a $20 and sends me on my way. The receptionist is sure to validate the parking ticket that Sam gave me, and I head on out. On the way out, Sam grins at me and asks for my ticket. I place it in the machine in his station. It sees the validation I got, and lets me out for free. Sam glares at me as I drive off into the late morning sun. The next one is titled, "Dealt with a Lying Landlord by Threatening to Run Up Their Bills." I had a landlord in the past who slipped a 90-day notice requirement into the rental contract after I had signed it. I was house hunting, so at the end of my lease I asked to go to a month-to-month lease to make it easier to leave when the time came. Landlord and I agreed on a higher monthly price to compensate him for the lack of security, and I signed the contract at the office of a business they also owned downstairs. Landlord wasn't actually present, but one of their employees handled it. So, contract is signed and they go to make me a copy for my records, but are having an issue with the copier. After a few minutes they ask if they can text me when they get it to work. I naively agree, and head upstairs. 30 minutes or so later, they text me saying they got the copier to work, and I come pick up my copy. I didn't think to double check everything at the time. So, for the next few months I just pay my monthly rent while I look for a home. Finally found the right place, and the closing date was about 4 weeks out, so I immediately notified my landlord that I would be leaving on said date. Landlord responds that it's nice I found a home, but I would be responsible for the next 2 months' rent after that as well due to the 90-day notification requirement in the contract. I'm totally confused, so I go check my copy of the contract, and sure enough, there is a stipulation in there about that. I also notice that my initials from the top and bottom of each page, verifying that I have read that page, have somehow mysteriously shifted to being doubled up at the top of the page after this stipulation, with none on the bottom of that actual page. This was because they had inserted 2 lines of text detailing the 90-day reporting requirement, after I had already signed the paperwork. They didn't notice the formatting error it created, which was a dead giveaway of what was going on. I inform the landlord of this, and notify him that this is not a legally binding contract due to this issue, and state that I will not be paying any further rent beyond this month, and expect my deposit back without penalty. Unfortunately, he persists with stating that this is a legally binding contract, and he will pursue it in court in addition to withholding my deposit if I fail to pay, blah blah blah. I know I am legally in the right, but I don't want to have to deal with courts to settle it as that takes forever, so I come up with an alternative plan. The one thing he hadn't thought about was the fact that the contract included all utilities, as the unit didn't have separate meters, and did not have any language forbidding excessive use of them. It just so happened to be a particularly cold winter, so I informed my landlord that if he wanted to persist with his demands, I would be inclined to leave all of the windows open, crank the heat as high as it would go, open the refrigerator door, run the water 24/7, etc., and if he entered the apartment without my permission to turn any of these items off, I would report him to the police. I got confirmation that he would not pursue the extra month's rent or security deposit within 20 minutes. Edit, just so everyone knows how the story ended, this happened around December of 2016 if I remember correctly, and I did get my security deposit back, etc. Didn't pursue legal option because I didn't think it would end up being worth the time and trouble, though I understand the sentiment. The next one is titled, "I'm sorry, you have to ask reception to connect you to a long-distance call." Okay. Back in the 90s, I was a junior reporter on a northern UK provincial paper. Newspaper companies were, and still are, legendary cheapskates, and will find the most unbelievable ways to try to save even small amounts of money. Bearing in mind, this is long before the days of email, we relied on our phones to speak to anyone we needed to contact. These were mostly local calls, but there were quite a lot of agencies we might need to ask for responses to our stories that would be out of our area. For reasons lost to the mists of time, I needed to ring a press office that was somewhere down south. Let's say Bristol, for argument's sake. I tried to make the call, I got a dead tone. I tried again, the same. I borrowed a colleague's phone, just in case mine wasn't working, I still couldn't get through. So, I rang our receptionist, Jane, a terribly refined Scot, but with the soul of a rebel. She loved the editorial department. Our news editor used to sneak her a glass of wine from whatever boozer he was in when she rang round trying to find him when the editor was on the rampage looking for him. Me, Jane, I'm trying to ring XX press office and I can't get through. Is there something up with the phones? Jane, where is that office? Me, Bristol, why? Jane, that explains it. You can't ring long distance. Me, sorry, what? I can't ring long distance? Why not? Jane, didn't anyone tell your department? The MD decided it and the phones have been limited from today to save money on the phone bill. You have to ring through to reception to ask for a long-distance number, and I have to dial it for you. Me, really? That sounds like a really stupid idea. Jane, I know, but it's out of my hands. I turned to our news editor and told him. He laughed and then realized I wasn't joking. There ensued a short period of the reporters ringing numbers for places at varying distances from our office, where we worked out there was about a 10-mile radius before we had to ask reception to be connected. Our news editor wasn't having this, cue the malicious compliance. He rang Jane and profusely apologized for what we were about to do to her, and then commanded us to ask to be put through to any number, anywhere in the country, for the rest of the morning. We spent the next 2 hours completely swamping our poor, solo receptionist with requests to be put through to long-distance numbers. I made the call to the press office that I needed to make in the first place, but I also had a lovely chat with my aunt in Manchester and my sister in Scotland. There were about 20 of us in total, non-stop asking for long-distance calls to be put through, meaning Jane could barely answer another call, or deal with visitors until we broke for lunch. Needless to say, we came in the next day to find our right to make long-distance calls was reinstated. The next one is titled, Staff Sergeant Instructs Shaven-Headed Troops to Put on a Hat for Civilian Flight. I wasn't involved in this particular act but had it recounted to me by an old-time friend. We were discussing some bad bosses we had serving in the army and my pal was telling me about his boss that I only knew by name and reputation. The brief outline is that back in the 1980s British troops would sometimes fly out to Belize for jungle training on civilian flights. The minimum dress standard was collar and tie. What typically happened was a load of blokes in cheap suits would get bussed from the barracks to the airport and invariably head straight for the bars to get wankered before the flight. The grown-ups were always concerned about bad behavior and the fact that potentially it could portray the army in a bad light if there was any drunkenness or shenanigans. The day before departure one of the troops' platoons had all shaved their heads completely into the wood. Totally bald. Short and trimmed is acceptable, totally bald is a big no-no. This came to light when they turned up for a light PT session 24 hours before departure. The 40-ish guys were stood in a sorted civilian PT kit to find that the troop staff sergeant went totally apoplectic when he saw them, ranting and raving that they looked like ducking skinhead hooligans and that they were an embarrassment. The troop SSGT then made the glorious decision of instructing the men that rather than ducking embarrassing him going through the airport like a gang of skinheads, they would all have to wear a hat. Not so clever now, are you? Yes, they were. And that is where the malicious compliance came in. Next day, the ragtag shower of blokes, corporals and below, dressed in cheap nylon suits and stay-pressed trousers, met up outside the living accommodation to march round to the squadron offices where the rest of the squadron was waiting for the coaches to arrive. As they turned the corner, the whole camp fell apart laughing as the scruffiest cheap shoes, cheap suit-wearing body of men ever assembled turned up in 3 ranks, marching in perfect step, wearing sombreros, Stetsons, full-face balaclavas, flat caps, woolly hats, bowler hats, top hats and deerstalkers. And collar and tie, obviously. It was here that the squadron sergeant major stepped in and the guys were told to take the headwear off. Troops 1 to Troop SSGT 0. Years later, the Troop SSGT went on to be a regimental sergeant major, and I'd like to think he tells this story from his perspective too. The next one is titled, Grandma's Rules? Okay, you can leave then. This happened about 6 years ago when I worked at my local pub. Now for context, the landlord operated on a grandma's rules in the pub. Meaning anything you said or done that would offend my grandma or yours, then you're out. You don't offend grandma. Simple. I used to supervise the bar while my landlord dealt with the office stuff to help balance the workload. It was a great job overall, decent wage, was right on my doorstep, and the regulars were class. Except one. We shall call her Karen. Karen was getting married to one of the regulars and was a complete witch. She was this horrible morbidly obese woman who would complain about the size of the stools and how it doesn't fit her. What's worse is she doesn't acknowledge you. She would just huff and puff until she gets a new drink. I hated that, and so did every member of staff. One day I got fed up and ignored her because she snapped at me for saying hello. The situation went as follows: Karen, well, aren't you going to serve me? Me, why? K, grandma's rules? My grandma would be offended if I sat here with an empty glass for too long. I immediately had a light bulb moment and waited my moment to strike. I served her as normal and spoke to my landlord about her in the office. I explained what I wanted to do and he gave me the go-ahead. I went back to the bar where she was spitting fire at the new bar girl I was training. I just calmly told the bar girl to ignore her, serve the customers. I then took her drinks, poured them down the sink and asked her to leave. Karen, what are you doing? Me, sorry, grandma's rules. She thinks you're a witch and wants you to leave. Spoiler, the landlord is actually a landlady and my grandma. The next one is titled, You won't pay out my annual leave while I'm on vacation? I won't take vacations. I've been doing security for about 16 years now, and about 10 years ago I was doing on again off again shifts at a particular site, not relevant where. Anyway, I had a decent amount of annual leave hours under my belt, so I decided to take a vacation in a city down the coast, visiting a friend. The understanding was that while I was on vacation, my annual leave hours would pay out as if I were still working, but with 17% leave loading. So, about halfway through my vacation, the day after I'm due to get paid, I casually check my account, and the number is nowhere near what it should be. I go, okay, maybe they're a day late. 4 days later, after I get home, no improvement. So I ring up work and ask them what's the deal. What I get back is that when I'm on vacation, annual leave pays out on my regular roster hours. But I wasn't getting regular roster hours, so they were paying me for about 1 hour a day, instead of 8. I said, I went on vacation to use up annual leave. They said, well, that's what the rules are. So I stopped taking vacations. My annual leave hours built up. And built up. The company doesn't like anyone holding a huge number of annual leave hours, because if someone decided to quit out of the blue, the payout would be amazing. Saw one guy do this. He had enough hours to take the year off. Then he retired. So about 6 months later they came to me and said, why aren't you taking vacations? I said, I can't afford to. You guys don't pay out my annual leave hours while I'm off. Silence on the other end. Then, we'll see about that. All of a sudden, the policy changed. I took a nice long vacation. The next one is titled, You Can't Have Facial Hair Growing from Past Your Lips. Okay then. So this isn't my story, but my father's. My dad is a now retired police officer, which he did for 30 years. Over the years, he has worked patrol, undercover, as a detective, and as part of a D task force back in the 90s. About 5 years ago, he transferred to the local sheriff's department and once again returned to being a regular patrol officer. If you don't know, or live outside the US, sheriffs are elected as a part of local elections. During the 2018 election, our local sheriff had reached the maximum terms he could serve, leading to an open election. The one who ended winning was a person my dad was not the biggest fan of. Prior to his election, officers could have a mustache and goatee as long as it is well kept and not too long. But one of the first things that were changed was the facial hair policy. The new policy said that facial hair could not be grown past the edge of your lips. But it forgot one piece of the original policy that was important, the length. So here's what my dad did to piss off this new boss. He started growing a handlebar mustache. It didn't grow past his lips, but it was long enough that he could shape it with beard wax into a handlebar that was frankly huge. The ends reached to his ears when he didn't put wax in it. Well, this policy change didn't just change my dad. Many of the officers had goatees and were already a bit annoyed with the new boss. So about another 10 officers decided to join my dad in growing out handlebar mustaches as well. In a department of 25 officers, almost half were rocking handlebar stashes while going on patrol. Eventually, the new sheriff decided that the handlebar mustaches were getting out of hand and finally relented and reinstated the old policy. My dad had grown this out for about 2 months and I watched him quite literally cry when he shaved it. But he got his favorite facial hair to be allowed again. The last one is titled, You Want It Rolled? Okay. I work at an office supply store. Had a white boomer dude come in and snap at me about wanting a heavy-duty chair mat. Okay fine. So dude demands I roll it up. We don't usually roll the heavy ones because it's dang near impossible to do, especially for smaller people. I'm a 41 female, 5 feet 2 inches, 120 hash on a heavy day, and have a hard time with maneuvering heavy stuff, as you might imagine. So I tell him we don't usually roll this type, and he snaps that he just bought one last month and the guy had no problem rolling it. Okay, fine. So I take the mat over to our print center to get one of the ladies to tape it while I rolled it. Dude follows me and asks what's taking so long, because last time they took it in back and used a machine to roll it. Only took a minute. Looked right at him and told him we had nothing in the back. Well, you did last time. Okay sir. Rolled his mat up with the points facing out. He smacked himself in the face with it on the way out. I laughed. Thanks for listening.